Your translator is lying. Those 4 words would eventually freeze the most dangerous table in Manhattan, but that moment had not happened yet. Right now the only sound in the private dining room was the soft clink of crystal against polished walnut and the distant hum of traffic 30 floors below. Rain streaked down the glass walls of the Skyline restaurant, turning the city lights into long golden rivers across the night. At the center of the room sat Vincent Moretti, a man whose silence could make seasoned businessmen rethink entire careers. His charcoal suit was tailored within an inch of perfection, his silver watch catching the low amber light every time he moved his hand. Across from him, Chairman Daniel Kang of Seoul sat calm and unreadable, fingers lightly folded as if the stakes in front of him were no more stressful than ordering coffee. Between them stood Ethan Park, the translator, smiling with professional confidence as he bridged 2 worlds with carefully chosen English. Chairman Kang says he appreciates your willingness to partner, Ethan said smoothly. He believes tonight will begin a very profitable future for both sides. Vincent gave a slow nod, the kind that carried the weight of millions of dollars and reputations built over decades. Around the table, advisors and security men sat still, their attention sharp even while pretending to relax. Deals like this were never just business. They were territory, loyalty, power. But none of that seemed to matter to the person standing just a few feet away with a silver wine pitcher balanced carefully in her hand. Naomi Carter moved quietly beside the table, her black server uniform pressed perfectly, her posture straight, her expression neutral in the way that years of hospitality training required. To everyone in the room she was invisible. Just another waitress doing her job in one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Someone who poured the wine, replaced the glasses, and disappeared again without leaving a ripple in the air. Naomi stepped closer to refill Vincent's glass, tilting the pitcher with steady hands. The scent of aged Cabernet drifted upward as the deep red liquid touched crystal. Chairman Kang spoke again in Korean, his voice measured, polite, controlled. Naomi's hand stopped. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just a fraction of a second. Because the sentence she had just heard was not the sentence Ethan translated. Ethan smiled and said in English, Chairman Kang agrees with the investment structure and is ready to move forward. Naomi felt a cold weight settle in her chest. That was not what the man had said. Not even close. She kept pouring the wine, eyes lowered like every other server in the room, but her mind replayed the Korean words again, slow and precise, the way her grandmother used to make her repeat them at the kitchen table when she was 10 years old. The real sentence had been different. Very different. Chairman Kang had not accepted the deal. In fact, his exact words had been calm, almost polite, but unmistakable. If he signs tonight, he will not leave Seoul with control of his company. Naomi straightened, placing the bottle gently on the table. Ethan was already speaking again, his voice warm and confident as he continued translating the negotiation with perfect composure. Vincent reached for the pen resting beside the contract folder, the heavy black ink instrument glinting beneath the chandelier light. One signature. That was all it would take. Naomi glanced at the translator, then at Chairman Kang, whose face remained perfectly composed. Something about his eyes, though, told a different story. And suddenly Naomi Carter understood something that no one else at that table seemed to realize. The most dangerous lie in the room had just been spoken in perfect English. Naomi Carter did not move, but her mind did. The words she had heard in Korean echoed again, clear and unmistakable, each syllable shaped by the same careful tone her grandmother used when teaching her as a child. Chairman Daniel Kang had not accepted anything. He had delivered a warning disguised as politeness. Yet across the table Ethan Park continued speaking with calm precision, reshaping every sentence into something harmless, something agreeable, something that slowly pushed the conversation toward a signature that should never happen. The private dining room felt suddenly smaller to Naomi, even though the space stretched nearly 40 feet from wall to wall, framed by glass windows that revealed the glowing Manhattan skyline beyond the rain. The lights inside the room were soft and golden, designed to make wealthy guests feel comfortable, powerful, untouchable. Tonight the room held more than comfort. It held tension that hummed beneath every word. Vincent Moretti rested one hand on the contract folder while Ethan translated another sentence from Chairman Kang. He respects your leadership and believes your companies can build a powerful alliance, Ethan said smoothly. Naomi listened again to the Korean voice behind those English words. Chairman Kang had actually said something colder, something precise. He had said that the structure of the deal placed full operational authority in Seoul and that any partner unwilling to accept those conditions would not be welcome in future negotiations. It was not a threat, but it was certainly not agreement. Naomi felt the quiet weight of realization press deeper into her chest. This was not a small mistake. This was not an awkward translation choice. Ethan Park was changing the meaning of the conversation itself. Around the table the men in tailored suits watched carefully but calmly, trusting the language bridge standing between the two leaders. They believed they understood what was being said. They believed the room was moving toward partnership. Naomi knew something different. She stepped back from the table, placing the wine bottle gently onto the serving tray. Her movements remained smooth, professional, invisible. That was what servers were trained to be in places like this. Present but unnoticed. Useful but unimportant. Yet her ears continued following every word of Korean that crossed the table. Chairman Kang spoke again, slower this time, his voice steady and diplomatic. Ethan nodded once and then delivered another polished English sentence. Chairman Kang says he values transparency and believes trust will guide the success of this partnership. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. That translation was not simply softened. It was reversed. The Korean sentence had actually warned that trust must be earned through honest negotiation, something that had clearly not happened tonight. Naomi looked toward Chairman Kang for a brief second and saw something she did not expect. The chairman's eyes flickered toward her, only for a moment, but long enough to confirm what she suspected. He knew the translation was wrong. Yet he said nothing. Perhaps he was waiting. Perhaps he was watching. Or perhaps he was curious to see who in the room would notice first. Vincent Moretti opened the contract folder slowly, the paper inside reflecting the chandelier light above. The agreement inside represented months of preparation, countless meetings, and millions of dollars waiting on a single decision. Vincent picked up the pen again, holding it between his fingers with calm certainty. Naomi understood exactly what was about to happen. Within seconds the room would believe a deal had been accepted. But the truth, hidden behind a polite smile and a carefully chosen translation, was moving the conversation somewhere very different. Naomi Carter had spent years learning how to disappear inside rooms like this. Tonight she was beginning to understand that staying invisible might be the most dangerous choice she could make. The pen hovered above the paper, steady in Vincent Moretti's hand, the black ink tip less than an inch from the contract that could shift millions of dollars across continents before sunrise. The room felt strangely quiet, not the comfortable silence of fine dining but the careful stillness of people who understood the importance of the moment unfolding in front of them. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows behind Chairman Daniel Kang, turning the Manhattan skyline into streaks of gold and silver light. Naomi Carter stood 3 steps away from the table, holding her tray against her side, exactly where a server was supposed to stand. Present but silent. Close enough to refill a glass. Far enough to avoid becoming part of the conversation. Ethan Park adjusted his cuff slightly and smiled again with the same composed confidence he had shown all evening. Chairman Kang appreciates your trust, he said clearly. He believes this agreement will benefit both companies greatly. The English sounded polished, professional, reassuring. Naomi listened to the Korean words that had actually been spoken only seconds earlier. They were nothing like that translation. Chairman Kang had just said that the agreement concentrated too much authority in Seoul and that such imbalance could lead to serious complications if not addressed before any signatures were placed on the document. It was a warning. Calm. Diplomatic. But unmistakable. Ethan had turned it into praise. Naomi felt a slow breath move through her chest as the pattern became impossible to ignore. This was not one sentence translated incorrectly. It was every important sentence reshaped just enough to push the negotiation toward the outcome Ethan wanted. Naomi glanced toward Chairman Kang again. The chairman remained perfectly composed, his posture relaxed, his expression polite, but his eyes briefly followed Ethan with a quiet sharpness that did not match the translator's cheerful tone. He knew. Naomi was now certain of that. The question was why he was allowing it to continue. Vincent Moretti tapped the pen lightly against the contract folder, the sound soft but precise against the polished wood table. His advisors watched closely, though none of them spoke Korean and none of them appeared suspicious. To them the evening was unfolding smoothly. The translator was doing his job. The Korean executive was nodding politely. The agreement seemed ready to close. Naomi looked down at the silver tray in her hands, the reflection of the chandelier lights dancing across its polished surface. A server's job was simple. Do not interrupt. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not involve yourself in the business of the guests. Restaurants like this ran on that rule. Careers depended on it. Naomi had followed that rule for 3 years. But the Korean voice across the table spoke again, slower now, each word careful and deliberate. Naomi understood every syllable. Chairman Kang had just said that once the agreement was signed, the operational control of the joint company would immediately transfer to Seoul, and any objections raised later would be considered a breach of trust. It was not partnership. It was surrender disguised as cooperation. Ethan Park smiled and translated once more. Chairman Kang says he is excited to begin this partnership immediately. Naomi felt the air in the room change in a way no one else seemed to notice. Vincent Moretti gave a small nod and opened the final page of the contract. His pen moved closer to the paper. Naomi Carter understood something in that instant with perfect clarity. If the pen touched the page, the truth would be buried under a lie spoken in flawless English, and everyone in the room would believe it had been agreed upon. Vincent Moretti's pen moved closer to the paper, the polished black tip hovering just above the final signature line. The contract lay open beneath the chandelier light, its pages crisp and heavy, the kind of document designed to look permanent the moment ink touched it. Around the table no one spoke. Silence, in rooms like this, was not awkward. It was powerful. Every man present understood that a single signature could move millions of dollars across borders, reshape companies, and redefine influence between cities separated by thousands of miles and an ocean. Naomi Carter felt the stillness like pressure in the air. Her tray rested lightly against her hip, the metal cool against her uniform. From the outside she looked exactly as she had for the past hour, composed, quiet, unimportant. Just another server finishing a shift in a restaurant where the wine list cost more than most people's monthly rent. But inside her mind the Korean word she had heard seconds earlier replayed again with perfect clarity. Chairman Daniel Kang had not agreed to partnership. He had described a structure where operational authority would immediately transfer to Seoul once the document was signed. Vincent Moretti would still carry the investment risk, but he would no longer control the direction of the company he was funding. It was the kind of clause hidden behind polite language that could quietly dismantle a business empire before anyone realized what had happened. Yet Ethan Park stood confidently between the two men, delivering his English translations with calm professionalism, smoothing every warning into reassurance. Chairman Kang says he looks forward to working closely together, Ethan said with an easy smile. Vincent gave a small nod, his attention still fixed on the contract. The pen lowered another fraction of an inch. Naomi felt a small, tight knot form in her chest. She had spent years learning how to move unnoticed through rooms like this. The rules were simple. Do not interrupt powerful people. Do not involve yourself in conversations that are not yours. Restaurants depended on that quiet professionalism. Breaking that rule could cost a server everything. Naomi knew that. She also knew something else. If Vincent Moretti signed that paper believing the translation he had been given, the decision would not just be expensive. It would be irreversible. Naomi shifted her weight slightly and glanced toward Chairman Kang again. The chairman's posture had not changed, but his gaze moved briefly across the table, scanning the room with quiet patience. For a moment his eyes met Naomi's. It lasted less than a second, yet it carried a strange sense of awareness, as if he understood that someone else in the room had heard the truth behind the translation. Ethan Park continued speaking, filling the quiet space with smooth, confident English. Chairman Kang believes this agreement will strengthen both companies and create opportunities for years to come. The word sounded perfect. Too perfect. Naomi looked down at the tray again, watching the chandelier lights ripple across its polished surface like distant city lights reflected on water. She remembered the evenings at her grandmother's kitchen table years ago, repeating Korean phrases slowly until every tone and syllable sounded natural. At the time it had seemed like a small skill, something personal, something private. Tonight it had become something else entirely. Vincent Moretti inhaled slowly and lowered the pen the final inch toward the contract. Naomi Carter understood that within seconds the room would believe the deal had been accepted exactly as translated. And in that precise moment she realized something that changed everything. Remaining silent would no longer make her invisible. It would make her responsible. The pen finally touched the paper, but Vincent Moretti did not sign. Not yet. The tip rested lightly against the signature line, a quiet pause hanging in the room like the final second before a storm breaks. The men around the table leaned slightly forward, watching with the subtle focus of people who understood the value of timing. Rain continued sliding down the tall glass windows behind Chairman Daniel Kang, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blur of shimmering light. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still beside the table, her tray balanced in both hands, her posture calm, but her thoughts racing faster than her breathing. Ethan Park's voice filled the silence again, confident and smooth. Chairman Kang says he appreciates your decisiveness, he said. He believes strong leaders move quickly when opportunity appears. Naomi listened to the Korean sentence that had actually been spoken seconds earlier. Chairman Kang had not said anything about opportunity. His exact words had been measured and deliberate. He had said that once the agreement was signed, the operational command of the venture would move entirely to Seoul within 90 days, and that such control would not be renegotiated later. It was not encouragement. It was a final clarification. Naomi felt the quiet certainty settle deeper in her mind. The man across the table had just confirmed the trap. Ethan Park had simply hidden it behind polished English. Vincent remained silent, the pen still resting against the contract. He looked calm, but calm men like Vincent Moretti rarely made decisions without reading the room one final time. His eyes moved slowly across the table, scanning the faces around him. Advisors. Security. Chairman Kang. Finally his gaze passed briefly over Naomi, just another server in a black uniform standing quietly with a tray. He looked away without a second thought. Naomi lowered her eyes again, but the moment left a strange echo in her mind. For years she had learned to disappear in rooms like this, to move without interrupting the gravity of powerful conversations. Tonight that invisibility had placed her in the only position where the truth could still be heard. Ethan continued speaking, his tone relaxed and professional. Chairman Kang believes both companies will benefit from moving forward tonight. Naomi knew that sentence had never been spoken. The Korean voice across the table had actually said something colder. Chairman Kang had calmly stated that hesitation at this stage would suggest uncertainty, and uncertainty was not something his investors appreciated. The meaning was simple. Sign the agreement or walk away. Ethan had turned it into friendly encouragement. Naomi felt the weight of the moment press harder against her chest. She could remain silent. The deal would proceed. The room would congratulate itself on a successful negotiation. The lie would remain invisible behind perfect grammar. Or she could speak. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray as she watched Vincent lift the pen again, preparing to write his name. Naomi Carter understood one simple truth with absolute clarity. In less than 5 seconds, a man was about to sign away control of a company because he trusted the wrong voice in the room. Vincent Moretti's pen began to move. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just the slow, deliberate motion of a man used to making decisions that shifted the direction of entire companies. The tip touched the paper and traced the first small curve of ink across the contract. Naomi Carter felt her heartbeat rise in a quiet, steady rhythm that seemed louder than the rain outside the windows. 3 seconds. That was all it would take for the signature to be complete. Ethan Park watched with a satisfied calm that he tried to hide behind professional politeness. His posture remained relaxed, hands lightly folded, the expression of a translator who believed the negotiation had reached its perfect conclusion. Across the table, Chairman Daniel Kang remained still, his face composed, his eyes focused on Vincent with a patience that felt almost surgical. Naomi noticed something else in that gaze now. Not surprise. Not confusion. Expectation. As if the chairman knew exactly what was unfolding and was simply waiting to see how far the moment would go. The pen moved again, completing another line of Vincent's name. Naomi felt the truth press against her thoughts like a door about to burst open. The Korean words echoed again in her mind with perfect clarity, each phrase sharp and impossible to ignore. Operational authority will transfer to Seoul within 90 days. Objections raised afterward will not be recognized. The agreement is final once signed. None of those words had been spoken in English. Ethan Park had carefully replaced every warning with reassurance. Naomi understood why it worked. The lies were not loud. They were elegant. Subtle enough that anyone who did not understand Korean would never question them. Vincent lifted the pen briefly, preparing to finish the signature with the final stroke. Naomi tightened her grip on the silver tray. For a moment she saw herself exactly as the room saw her. A server. A background detail in a room full of powerful men. Someone whose voice did not belong in negotiations worth millions of dollars. Someone whose job was to refill glasses and disappear before the conversation became important. But another voice existed in her memory, one much older and steadier. Her grandmother's voice from years ago in a small kitchen filled with the smell of rice and tea. Words spoken slowly across the table as Naomi repeated Korean phrases again and again until they sounded natural. Language is not just sound, her grandmother had once told her. It is truth. If you understand the language, you understand what people really mean. Vincent's pen lowered again toward the paper. Naomi realized something that changed the weight of the moment completely. If she remained silent now, the lie would not belong only to the translator. It would belong to her too. The final stroke of the signature was about to begin when Naomi Carter took one quiet step forward. The step Naomi Carter took was small, but in a room like this even a small movement could shift the air. The silver tray in her hands lowered slowly to the edge of the service table beside her, the metal touching wood with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Vincent Moretti's pen hovered above the contract again, the final stroke of his name unfinished. For a moment he did not look up. Men like Vincent rarely reacted to distractions. But Naomi's voice reached the table before the ink could finish its path. "Sir," she said quietly. The word was calm, respectful, but it carried just enough weight to interrupt the silence of the room. Vincent's pen stopped. Not dramatically. Just a pause. The kind of pause that made everyone else stop breathing without realizing it. Ethan Park's head turned immediately, his expression shifting from polite composure to sharp irritation in less than a second. A server speaking during a negotiation like this was not part of the evening's plan. Naomi stood straight, hands now empty at her sides, her voice steady even though her pulse still moved fast beneath the calm surface she had learned to wear at work. "Sir," she said again, looking directly toward Vincent, "before you sign that, there is something you should hear." The room went still in a new way now. Not the quiet of business, but the quiet of surprise. One of Vincent's advisors leaned slightly forward, his eyebrows tightening in confusion. Ethan Park took a step toward Naomi, his smile returning quickly, though it looked thinner than before. "Miss, this is a private meeting," he said smoothly. "Please return to your station." Naomi did not move. Her eye stayed on Vincent. She had already crossed the invisible line that separated staff from guests, and she knew there was no graceful way to step back now. Vincent slowly lowered the pen onto the table and leaned back in his chair, studying her with calm curiosity. He did not look angry. That made the moment even heavier. The most powerful people in rooms like this did not need to raise their voices to control a situation. Ethan spoke again, his tone tightening slightly. "She probably misunderstood something," he said, glancing toward Vincent with a quick reassuring nod. "Language can be confusing if someone overhears fragments." Naomi felt the tension in the room shift again, subtle but unmistakable. Chairman Daniel Kang remained silent across the table, his hands folded, his gaze resting quietly on Naomi now with the same careful attention he had shown all evening. Vincent tapped the contract once with his finger and then looked up at Naomi fully for the first time. His eyes were sharp, evaluating, measuring. "You interrupted a negotiation," he said calmly. "So whatever you say next should be worth it." Naomi drew a slow breath. For a moment she remembered standing in her grandmother's kitchen years ago, repeating Korean sentences until every sound felt natural on her tongue. She remembered the lesson that came with those words. Language reveals what people hide. Naomi looked directly at Vincent and spoke clearly. "Your translator is not telling you what Chairman Kang is actually saying." Ethan Park's smile disappeared completely. The silence that followed was so complete that even the rain against the glass seemed to fade behind it. For a long second no one in the room moved. The rain against the glass walls returned to everyone's ears like a distant whisper as the meaning of Naomi Carter's words settled over the table. Ethan Park was the first to react. He let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in his eyes. "That is an interesting claim," he said calmly, turning slightly toward Vincent Moretti as if the interruption had already been resolved. "But I assure you the translation has been accurate the entire evening." Naomi did not look at Ethan. Her attention remained fixed on Vincent, because she understood something important about men like him. Power did not respond to panic. It responded to certainty. Vincent rested both hands on the table now, the pen lying beside the contract where he had set it down moments earlier. His gaze moved slowly from Naomi to Ethan, and then across the table to Chairman Daniel Kang, whose expression had not changed. The chairman remained composed, his posture relaxed, his eyes quietly observant as though he were watching a chess move unfold that he had expected all along. Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Naomi again. "You are telling me," he said in a calm, measured tone, "that my translator is not translating correctly." Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." Ethan stepped forward half a pace, his voice still polite but sharper now. "With respect, she overheard fragments of a language she probably does not fully understand." Naomi finally turned her head toward him, her voice steady. "I understood every word." The room grew still again. One of Vincent's advisors shifted slightly in his chair, glancing between the two of them. The rain outside continued sliding down the glass behind Chairman Kang, streaking the skyline lights into long ribbons of gold. Ethan shook his head with controlled patience. Chairman Kang has been discussing partnership terms. Nothing more complicated than that. Naomi faced Vincent again. He has not been discussing partnership. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in focus. Then what has he been discussing? Naomi took a slow breath. The moment felt heavier now that everyone in the room was watching her, but the words came out clear. He said that once the agreement is signed, operational authority will move entirely to Seoul within 90 days, and that any objections afterward will not be considered. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not surprise anymore. It was calculation. Vincent turned his head slowly toward Ethan. Ethan opened his mouth immediately. That statement was about structural coordination between the companies. It is normal language in international agreements. Naomi spoke again before Vincent could respond. That is not how he said it. Vincent raised a hand slightly, stopping the exchange without raising his voice. Then he turned his attention across the table to Chairman Kang. "Would you mind repeating your last statement?" Vincent said calmly, in Korean. Chairman Kang inclined his head with quiet politeness. When he spoke again, the Korean words were slow and deliberate, each syllable perfectly clear in the silent room. Naomi listened. Ethan listened too. But this time no one spoke immediately afterward. Chairman Daniel Kang finished speaking and the Korean word settled into the room like carefully placed stones, each one deliberate, impossible to ignore once heard clearly. No one spoke for a moment. The silence stretched across the polished table, across the crystal glasses and untouched wine, across the rain-streaked windows that looked down over Manhattan's glowing night. Vincent Moretti did not move immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the chairman, his expression calm but sharpened with attention. The kind of attention that powerful men reserve for moments when something important has just shifted beneath the surface. Ethan Park stood very still beside the table. For the first time since the meeting had begun, his polished confidence looked slightly strained, like a smile that had stayed on too long. Vincent finally leaned forward a fraction, folding his hands together on the table. "Go ahead," he said quietly, turning his head toward Ethan. "Translate." Ethan cleared his throat softly. The room waited. "Chairman Kang says," Ethan began, his voice steady again, "that the agreement confirms Seoul will coordinate the operational structure of the partnership within 90 days, which is standard procedure for joint ventures." The sentence sounded professional. Reasonable. Carefully neutral. Naomi Carter felt the words land in the air and remain there, polished but hollow. Vincent did not nod. He did not look satisfied. Instead his gaze shifted slowly toward Naomi. "You heard something different," he said. Naomi did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair. The movement was small, but everyone at the table felt it. "Then translate it yourself." Naomi glanced briefly toward Chairman Kang, who was already watching her with the same composed expression he had maintained all evening. The chairman inclined his head almost imperceptibly, as if granting permission without speaking a word. Naomi turned back to Vincent. Her voice remained calm, clear enough for everyone at the table to hear. Chairman Kang said that once the agreement is signed, operational authority will move completely to Seoul within 90 days, and that any attempt to challenge that control later would be considered a breach of trust. The air in the room seemed to tighten. Naomi continued before anyone could interrupt. He also said that hesitation tonight would suggest uncertainty, and uncertainty would make future cooperation impossible. One of Vincent's advisors shifted slightly in his chair, his expression tightening as he looked toward Ethan. Ethan spoke quickly now, the smoothness in his tone replaced by urgency disguised as professionalism. That interpretation exaggerates the language. Chairman Kang was referring to coordination, not control. Vincent raised one finger again without looking at him, silencing the explanation instantly. Then he turned slowly toward Chairman Kang. "Is what she said accurate?" Chairman Kang did not answer immediately. Instead he looked at Naomi for a brief moment with quiet interest, as though measuring something beyond the words themselves. Then he turned back to Vincent and spoke again in Korean, his voice calm and precise. Naomi listened carefully, every syllable clear in her mind. When he finished, Chairman Kang finally switched to English himself, speaking with a measured accent that carried no hesitation at all. "Yes," he said simply. "That is exactly what I said." For several seconds no one in the room spoke. The words Chairman Daniel Kang had just delivered in calm, clear English seemed to settle over the table like a weight that could not be ignored. "Yes. That is exactly what I said." The rain against the glass walls continued its steady rhythm while the skyline shimmered below, but inside the private dining room the atmosphere had changed completely. Vincent Moretti did not look surprised. He looked thoughtful, which was far more unsettling. Slowly he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together in front of him, studying the contract that still lay open on the table. The unfinished signature stared back at him like a question. Ethan Park stood motionless beside the table now, the easy composure he had carried all evening replaced by a tight stillness. For the first time he did not rush to fill the silence with explanations. Vincent lifted his eyes toward him at last. The look was not loud or dramatic, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly when a situation had shifted. "You told me something different," Vincent said calmly. Ethan inhaled slowly, forcing a polite smile that did not quite return to his eyes. "Chairman Kang's language can be interpreted in several ways," he replied carefully. "International negotiations often contain phrasing that." Vincent raised his hand slightly and the explanation stopped immediately. The room became silent again. Vincent turned his attention toward Naomi Carter. She still stood near the edge of the table, hands relaxed at her sides, the silver tray resting behind her on the service station where she had placed it minutes earlier. Under normal circumstances, a server would have already been escorted out of the room for interrupting a private negotiation. But nothing about this moment felt normal anymore. Vincent studied her with a long, measuring look. "How do you speak Korean?" he asked. Naomi answered honestly. "My grandmother raised me for most of my childhood. She immigrated from Busan before I was born. She believed language was something you should carry with you, so she taught me." Vincent nodded slowly, absorbing that. Across the table, Chairman Kang watched quietly, his eyes reflecting a calm curiosity that had replaced the earlier diplomatic distance. He looked less like a negotiator now and more like someone observing a problem finally revealing its true shape. One of Vincent's advisors leaned forward slightly, speaking carefully. "If the translation we received tonight has not been accurate, the entire structure of the agreement may need to be reconsidered." Vincent did not look at him. His attention remained on the open contract and the half-written signature that had nearly sealed it minutes earlier. The ink line stopped abruptly, a reminder of how close the decision had come. Vincent finally closed the contract folder with one smooth motion and rested his hand on top of it. The sound of paper meeting paper echoed softly in the quiet room. Then he looked toward Chairman Kang again. "It seems," Vincent said calmly, "that we should restart this conversation with everyone understanding the same language." Chairman Kang inclined his head slightly, a faint smile appearing for the first time that evening. And across the room, Naomi Carter realized something remarkable. For the first time since the meeting began, the truth was finally the loudest voice in the room. The room did not return to normal after Vincent Moretti closed the contract. If anything, the silence became sharper, like the air just before a thunderstorm finally breaks. Vincent rested his hand on top of the folder for a moment, then slowly slid it a few inches away from the center of the table, as though moving a dangerous object out of reach. The unfinished signature still glistened faintly under the chandelier light, a thin black line that now looked less like a commitment and more like a warning. Ethan Park finally spoke again, but the calm confidence that had carried him through the evening was gone. "Mr. Moretti, there may be a misunderstanding here," he said carefully. "International agreements often contain phrasing that sounds stronger than it is when translated directly." Vincent did not even look at him. His attention had shifted back across the table to Chairman Daniel Kang. "Let us make something clear," Vincent said quietly. "If the authority of the company moves entirely to Seoul, that is not coordination. That is control." Chairman Kang listened with calm patience. Then he folded his hands on the table and spoke again in slow, deliberate English, choosing each word with precision. "In my experience," he said, "control is usually the most honest description." The statement settled into the room like a stone dropped into water. One of Vincent's advisors leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly as the implications began to spread through the group. Months of negotiation had almost ended with a signature that would have handed operational power to another continent without a single objection. Vincent finally turned his head toward Ethan. The look was not angry. It was colder than anger. "You removed that meaning from your translation," Vincent said. Ethan opened his hand slightly in a defensive gesture. "I adjusted the phrasing to maintain a cooperative tone. That is common practice in negotiations." Naomi Carter remained where she stood, watching the exchange quietly. For the first time since she had spoken, she felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. The truth had already entered the room, and once truth was spoken clearly, it had a way of refusing to leave. Vincent leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as he looked directly at Ethan. "There is a difference between cooperation and concealment," he said calmly. Ethan did not answer immediately. Across the table, Chairman Kang observed the moment with the same quiet composure he had shown all evening, but now there was something new behind his eyes. Respect. Not for the negotiation. For the interruption that had forced honesty back into the conversation. Vincent finally leaned back again and turned his gaze toward Naomi. You realized what was happening before anyone else in this room, he said. Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. Vincent studied her for a moment longer, then allowed the faintest trace of a smile to appear. It was not the smile of a man amused by the situation. It was the smile of a man who understood exactly how close he had come to signing something he should never have agreed to. Outside the windows the rain had begun to slow, and the city lights below grew sharper through the glass. Inside the room the negotiation had changed direction entirely. And the only person who had not been invited to the table had become the one who had saved it. Vincent Moetti remained seated for a moment after his faint smile faded, his fingers resting lightly on the closed contract folder as if he were feeling the weight of what almost happened. The room had grown quieter in a different way now, not tense but reflective, the kind of quiet that follows the realization that a single moment can change the direction of an entire decision. Outside the glass walls the rain had softened to a gentle mist drifting across the skyline, and the lights of Manhattan shimmered more clearly against the dark sky. Chairman Daniel Kang leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Vincent with the calm patience of a man who understood that the negotiation had entered a new phase. The earlier tension between the two sides had dissolved into something more honest now. Vincent finally spoke again, his voice steady. Let us begin again, he said. This time with the exact meaning of every sentence on the table. Chairman Kang inclined his head politely. That would be wise. Ethan Park stood very still beside the table, his hands folded in front of him, the confidence that had once defined his posture replaced by careful restraint. He seemed to understand that the room had moved past him, that the conversation no longer depended on his voice to continue. One of Vincent's advisors quietly slid the contract folder toward the center of the table again, opening it to the first page. The paper no longer looked like a finished agreement. It looked like a draft waiting to be rewritten with the truth included this time. Vincent glanced once toward Naomi Carter before turning back to Chairman Kang. Please, he said, gesturing lightly toward the chairman. Chairman Kang began speaking again in Korean, his voice even and deliberate. Naomi listened carefully, the familiar rhythm of the language settling into her ears as naturally as breathing. The chairman explained the structure of the venture clearly this time, outlining the transfer of operational authority to Seoul, the financial contributions expected from Vincent's side, and the strategic control that would remain with Kang's company after the transition period. When he finished, Vincent looked briefly toward Naomi. Translate, he said. Naomi hesitated for only a fraction of a second before repeating the chairman's statement in English, her voice calm and precise. The words filled the room without distortion, carrying exactly the same meaning they had in Korean. Vincent listened closely, his eyes focused, weighing each sentence carefully. When she finished he nodded once. That is clearer. Chairman Kang smiled faintly, as though the conversation had finally reached the level of honesty he had been waiting for all evening. The discussion continued for several minutes, slower now, every phrase examined carefully before moving forward. No one rushed. No one assumed. And for the first time that night, every person at the table understood exactly what was being said. Naomi remained standing beside the service table, translating only when asked, her presence no longer invisible but quietly essential to the conversation unfolding in front of her. What had started as an unnoticed interruption had turned into something else entirely. A negotiation that had nearly been sealed by misunderstanding was now being rebuilt with precision, one truthful sentence at a time. The conversation slowed after that, not because anyone had lost interest, but because every word now carried weight that no one wanted to misinterpret again. Chairman Daniel Kang continued explaining the structure of the venture while Naomi Carter translated each sentence carefully, her voice steady and precise. The negotiation that had nearly been decided in a few rushed minutes now unfolded with deliberate patience. Vincent Moetti listened closely, asking questions that had not appeared earlier in the evening when he believed everything had already been clarified. Numbers were reviewed again. Responsibilities were adjusted. The timeline of control was rewritten so that authority would remain shared rather than shifting entirely across the Pacific. When the final version of the agreement was eventually placed back on the table, the paper looked almost identical to the earlier document, but its meaning had changed completely. Vincent studied the last page for several seconds before picking up the pen again. This time the room was not tense. It was focused. Naomi stood quietly beside the service station, watching as the pen moved across the paper and completed the signature that had nearly happened an hour earlier under very different circumstances. Vincent closed the folder and slid it toward Chairman Kang, who signed his own name with the same calm precision. For a moment both men sat back in their chairs, the negotiation finally complete. Chairman Kang allowed himself a small smile. "Honest conversations take longer," he said in English, "but they usually build stronger partnerships." Vincent nodded once. Then his attention shifted toward Naomi. The room followed his gaze. Naomi felt the sudden awareness settle on her again, the realization that the evening would have ended very differently if she had remained silent. Vincent stood slowly from his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than dramatic. "Miss Carter," he said, "you changed the outcome of this entire negotiation." Naomi lowered her eyes slightly, the habit of humility returning now that the tension had passed. "I only said what I heard, sir." Vincent looked at the contract folder resting on the table. Sometimes that is the most important thing anyone can do. Chairman Kang rose as well, offering a respectful nod toward Naomi. "Language reveals truth," he said calmly. "You understood that tonight better than anyone else in this room." The advisors around. The table began gathering their documents, the quiet sounds of chairs shifting and papers closing replacing the earlier tension. Outside the windows the rain had stopped completely, leaving the city lights bright and clear against the dark sky. Naomi reached for the silver tray again, returning it to her hands as naturally as if the evening had been like any other shift. But as she turned toward the door, Vincent spoke once more. "Miss Carter." She paused and looked back. Vincent gestured toward the table where the empty seat beside him remained open. "Next time we have a conversation that important," he said calmly, "you might consider sitting at the table instead of standing beside it." Naomi Carter did not answer immediately. She simply gave a small respectful nod before continuing toward the door. And as the quiet room settled after the longest negotiation of the night, one truth remained impossible to ignore. The person no one noticed when the evening began had been the only one who truly understood what was being said.